Having fished the feeder almost exclusively for the last 10 years, there are lots and lots of things that we've found to quite often catch us those extra fish, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with you in this video. I'm going to be showing you 3 of the key details that we employ and use within our fishing on a wide variety of venues, and these are the things that can almost certainly catch you some of those extra fish. One of the most overlooked details within feeder fishing has to be the consistency of your ground bait. There are so many different ground baits out there, there are so many different ingredients that we often find that yes, you might be using a mix that is known to work on a venue that you know, it might be your favourite mix that you use on different venues. However, more often than not, there are different ways of actually mixing that ground bait, i.e. the actual amount of water that you add to that ground bait, and that can ultimately have a huge impact on the way that you are actually presenting your bait. Now, we have actually seen on several occasions where there may be anglers sat in a row when we're practicing for team events that even down to the consistency of the same mix could actually determine the species of fish that you're catching. Now, I've got a ground bait here to show you. This is Super Feeder. Okay, it is a mix I've used a lot, alright, but I'm not showing you this because this is a fantastic mix. I'm showing you this because this is a mix that's very, very similar to lots of the mixes out there. It is a fish meal mix. This one is sweet fish meal. And I've actually got this mixed up in 3 different consistencies because I want to show you in the tank how they actually act under water when you load your feeder. Now, the 3 consistencies that we've got here are basically, it's obviously the same mix, it's 100%, so there's nothing else mixed with this mix. Okay, so the first one there is dry, so we've got a nice dry mix there, as you can see. Alright, and that obviously, as the name suggests, is it hasn't had loads of water put to it, so it is a really dry consistency. However, that is still able, and it's got enough water in there to stay within the feeder to withstand a cast. The next one we've got is what I would say it's the average sort of a mix, so it's slightly damp. I haven't put this through a sieve or a riddle or anything like that, and this mix is by no means an active mix because I just want to show you that by using a mix that isn't active, that you can still present it in different ways. And then the final version there is what we basically refer to as over wet, and as the name suggests, that means that that has had more water added to it, so it's almost a slop. But we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So what we're going to do is I'm actually going to load this feeder up here. Alright, so we've got a nice open-ended plastic feeder there, as you can see, a side-weighted feeder. Alright, I will be talking to you a little bit more about feeder design, and all I'm going to do is basically load this up with the dry mix. Okay, just end to end, it's just an open-ended feeder, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop this in the tank and just see how this actually performs in the tank. So I'll drop that in there. That's gone straight to the bottom, and as you can see, it's starting to break down. Now, because it's a plastic feeder, it's basically only giving water access to that ground bait through either end. Alright, so it's through either end. As you can see, it's breaking down now. If we look from above, it's breaking down, it's coming out of either end, as you can see. And because it's a plastic feeder, you can see there's the odd pocket of air coming off, and that's what happens with a drier mix. Alright, now this is, as you can see, it's by no means an active mix. Alright, it's not that sort of a mix. However, certainly a lot of cereal mixers or non-fish meal mixers can be very active, and what can happen in that sort of a scenario is that with active mixers they can actually draw in smaller fish and fish that generally want a little bit more activity. So a common trend would that be, we would employ a dry mix if you were after roach, for example. Roach live up in the water, you know, they're obviously usually smaller fish darting in and out of the peg, and that's where they could be feeding off the particles that are fizzing and coming off the feeder. Alright, so if you're faced with a situation where you may be getting plagued with small fish, then it could be because the actual consistency of a ground bait is a little bit too dry. Obviously, the type of mix that you've got, if it's got lots of hemp in there, for example, or crushed hemp, then that in itself can be really, really active. So that obviously is an ingredient thing that could be drawing small fish in. So if you're in that sort of scenario, just try dampening your mix down a little bit. Okay, so that is what you've just seen. You've seen that happen. What's happened there, just so you can see the cloud come off this as we empty the feeder. There we go, look at that. So that is basically a huge cloud that's been created just by you retrieving the feeder. And this is something that a lot of people kind of overlook. You know, they think that when they cast the feeder out, they sit there and wait for the bite, and as soon as they pick up to reel in, they kind of think, well, that's it, you know, they've done all they can. It's about reeling in, loading the feeder up and going back out there. But what you've actually just done there is, just by retrieving the feeder, you've automatically put an extra cloud in your swim. And this is one of the things that a lot of people overlook, in the sense that sometimes ground bait in itself is enough to draw fish in. You know, it's not all about the particles. You obviously, these ground baits, particularly this one as well, it's a sweet fish meal, it's got lots of smell coming off it. It's not really known for being a cloudy mix, but as you've just seen there, just by, you didn't get that cloud when it first went in, did you? You know, you didn't get any sort of a cloud when it first went in. So basically, while that's been in there, some of those particles have obviously, some of the ingredients have soaked up some more of the water, and then by the time you go to retrieve, you've had a lovely nice white cloud. And sometimes you could cast straight in over the top of that and you could get a fish. Alright, so it's just about thinking about those little details. What I'm going to do now is, what I'm going to do is just switch that feeder now from a plastic feeder to a cage feeder. Side weighted again. There we go. I'll show you that one so you can see the style of it. So it's side weighted. Obviously, as the name suggests, the weight is on the side, but with this particular feeder, if you look at the actual cage of it, the wire, it's really thin. It's a really slim wire cage feeder, and that basically means that the water is going to be able to get to this ground bait really quickly. So what we should see with this dry mix is see it break down even quicker. Alright, so let's just pop that in the tank. There we go, and that's almost emptied on the bottom straight away. Look how quickly that's emptying now. Super fast breakdown. That's really quick, isn't it? And that's just about empty now. Just about empty. If I just focus that camera for you. There we go. That's completely done now. Look, there's no fizzing really coming off it. The water's got to that, and that's done now. And that's where your feeder choice comes in. Alright, so whatever feeder you're using, something else that we're going to look at in a moment, the style of the feeder can have a huge impact on the way that your ground bait is reacting. As you've just seen with the plastic one, it was still kind of breaking down at this stage. However, that cage feeder, as you've just seen, that is already complete. In fact, it's just about empty. There we go, look at that. And that's literally been in there probably a minute, less than a minute. Okay, so it's not only about the ground bait consistency, it's about the choice of the feeder that you use with that ground bait, if that makes sense. So what I'm going to do now is, we're going to switch to what I would say the average mix. So this is the mix this is the one over here that is probably, it's the sort of consistency that most people would have it to start a session with. I'm just going to load that cage feeder again. Alright, there we go. And what we should see now is a different sort of a breakdown, because this ground bait has had more water, you know. It's had more water in it. Just pop that in the tank. Straight there. And as you can see, that's a slower breakdown. It's still quite fast, to be honest. It's still faster than what I imagined, but it is a slower breakdown, and that's because this ground bait, it's had more water basically. It's had more water in it. Those particles and those bits of pellet in there and all that, they've had more time, they've had more water given to them, so they are that little bit more in it, you know, in a, there we go. Still going to be a quick breakdown with that feeder because of that fine wire. The water's got to that, and if you like to retrieve that now, so you know, that's the next step that you need to think about. It's something else we're going to look at in a minute with a different style of feeder, is the retrieve. You've got to think that if you are going to be getting quick bites, for example, if you're getting bites as soon as your feeder's going in, you want that feeder to be emptying right there, you know, the minute or the second that you hook that fish. You don't want it to be emptying on the way back to you. Alright, and that's something that you really need to think about, and it's something we'll talk about in a moment. Now watch what happens. We haven't had any sort of cloud come off that, have we? No cloud of it coming off it, but watch what happens when I pick this feeder up now to come in. Feeder's empty, and you've had a cloud. You can see all the particles, bits of bait falling through the water, and that can be enough to draw fish in. Alright, so it's just about thinking about these little details. Alright, now the final mix that we've got here, as you can see, that water's clouded up quite a bit now, but the particles are going down. Now with this over wet mix, if you can see here, it's almost a slop. Now the consistency of that you have the slop is obviously very, very important, particularly when you're feeder fishing. You know, we fish with lots of sloppy ground baits if you're fishing with a pole, for example, and you might be throwing this sort of a slop in by hand, and that's obviously one way of fishing. However, with a feeder, the consistency of this needs to be, obviously, it needs to be wet, obviously, so you're going to get the right effect. But it can't be too wet because it's going to come out of the feeder when you cast in, isn't it? So that's something that you need to bear in mind. Now what I'm going to do is, with this wet mix here, I'm just going to drop that in there just to see what happens. And that's gone down to the bottom. You've got a bit of a cloud coming off it, and that's gone to the bottom. Now this mix is slightly different from lots and lots of other mixes, alright? So there are lots of pellet based mixes out there that go a lot sloppier than this. Some mixes actually almost bind together and create a paste, and that's actually what's happening with this particular mix. There aren't that many mixes where that happens, you know, and some pole anglers actually use these style of mixes to create paste when they're fishing with paste on the pole. Alright, so just have a look at the mixes that you're using, but most of them, when you do over wet them, they don't go claggy. Most of them just do go into a slop, so when they hit the surface, you've got a nice big wet cloud on the surface. Alright, now the next thing that we need to talk about really with the consistency is that if you have got a dry mix, so if you've got a mix that's very active, if it's very, very dry, then obviously you're going to have bits coming off it, you know, some bits may even float. Alright, so that's something that you need to be very, very wary of, because yes, obviously it can draw in small fish. We've already discussed that, particularly roach and smaller fish. And on some occasions you might actually want that, but on some occasions you won't. Alright, so be very cautious about using an active style mix if you don't want small fish. And the other thing as well is, if you've got a ground bait that's got particles coming off it, those drier particles are wanting to float. Because they're dry, they're wanting to float, so they're wanting to rise to the top. Alright, now that can be a great way of drawing fish into your swim. However, fish can get preoccupied with those particles up in the water. We are talking about feeder fishing. Ultimately, we want the fish down on the bottom, don't we? That's where we want them. So we don't want them to be looking up and chasing baits up in the water column. You know, it's not going to help you out to catch fish on the feeder. So this is why the over wet style mixers can be so effective, because they're over wet. You're getting a cloud off it, but because they are over wet, they are sinking. So whilst you still might have, you know, a cloud up in the water column here, it is ultimately sinking down, and that is where you can obviously try and encourage the fish to look down, which is where your feeder and more importantly your hook bait is going to be. So if you can get the fish looking down, do that. Alright, you don't want fish up in the air. It can be a great tactic to draw fish into the swim initially, a bit of activity, saying look, there's some food here. But obviously once you get them there, you then need to somehow try to manage that to get them then down on the bottom, which is where they're going to be easier to catch. And that leads us right into number two. Number two is the loading of the feeder. Now, I can totally understand and totally appreciate and quite often really love the fact that most people are out there on the bank to just enjoy their days fishing. Lots of the matches that we fish, particularly some of the feeder matches, they are quite social affairs. And when you're sat talking to anglers either side of you, that is obviously a very big part of our day and enjoyment of the sport. However, when you're doing that, it's quite easy to not really be aware of what you're doing, and loading the feeder is one of them. I see it all the time, you know, anglers that are just loading the feeder, not really thinking about it, filling the feeder up and casting out, and that's it. And it's quite often that the loading of the feeder can be having a direct impact or affecting what's happening out there in your swim. Alright, now the first prime example is one that we've briefly mentioned, and that is, if you're getting bites quick, try not to pack the ground bait into the feeder too tightly. You know, depending on the style of feeder that you're using as well, you might find that you know, there are feeders out there that are going to encourage the ground bait to stay in the feeder for longer, and that might be something that you want to do if you're fishing in deep water, for example. If you want to make sure that the feeder is still full when it hits the bottom, that is definitely something that we do in deeper water. However, if you are getting quick bites, the feeder's not getting a chance to empty, and what quite often is, well, obviously it's good if you're getting bites so quickly, particularly if you're hooking the fish as well, but in the long term it's not good, because it's a scenario that I've seen lots and lots of times. How many times have you been out there fishing and you've started off really well? You might have had 3 or 4 in the first 3 casts, you know, and had a really good start, but then all of a sudden, after 10, 20 minutes, half an hour, all of a sudden you start getting little indications, you're getting line bites, you might be missing the odd bite, and quite often that is the reason, you know, those first few fish that you've caught, the first few casts, yes, you've caught fish, which is brilliant, or you've had bites, but then whilst you've been playing those fish back towards you, that is when the feeder's emptied, and that's when you can end up with almost a trail of bait coming back towards you, and that can be one of the reasons for getting those liners and indications, because over the course of those few casts, there's no longer a nice neat little pile of bait right where you're hitting your line clip. There's bait coming back towards you, so you could find that there are fish grazing and touching your line or your braid coming back towards you. So that is why it's very important, and this is why we carry so many different styles of feeder. You've just seen how quickly the cage feeder emptied. That is the style of feeder that will be ideal for that, because it's going to be emptying within 20 or 30 seconds of it actually going in. And this is where other feeders can cause problems in this scenario. Alright, now one of the most common feeders that a lot of people use now are window feeders. I've got one here to show you. That's a basic window feeder. There are loads of different styles out there. However, these feeders, whilst they cast really nice, whilst a lot of people prefer them in deeper water because they encapsulate the bait, you know, they actually hold on to the ground bait for a long time, and that's why they can be so good in deeper water. However, if you are getting quick bites with a feeder like this, you know, you might find that the scenario we've just talked about is one that, you know, it's quite common, because these feeders aren't really designed for emptying quickly. You know, it's just not that sort of a feeder. So if I load that window feeder up now for you, I'm going to drop that into the tank. There we go. And the first thing that you see is standing up. All right, and you know, and that can be the case depending on how you hit your line clip, depending on how tight you have in your line. You might have your line tight to the feeder, which will help the feeder to lay on its side. So if you suddenly tighten up to that with your tip, then obviously that's going to encourage it to lay down. But as you can see, I'm even going to lift it up and move it over there. As you can see, that's not laying down very well, is it? But what you'll also see is when I go to move it, I know I'm only moving that slow, but it's just holding on to the bait, you know. So a feeder like this is not great for emptying right out there on the spot, you know. So if you are going to fish with a feeder like this, as you can see, still stood up. If you are going to fish with a feeder like this, just be very, very careful and very just aware of how tight you're actually packing the bait in. Alright, you might only just want to lightly thumb it or squeeze it. You might have a wetter mix that's going to empty you know, much quicker. But I mean, while I'm talking now, you can still see, I know there isn't any live baits in there. Obviously if you had maggots in there, the maggots would be helping to break that down and empty it. But as you can see, the ground bait's still in there. Okay, but these feeders weren't really designed for feeding just ground bait anyway, you know. These were designed for initially for kind of loose feeding particles, you know, plenty of maggots, casters, and then just capping it off with ground bait. So if you had got live baits in there, as you can see, the ground bait is still in there, and that's because it's just so well protected, you know, from because of the plastic sides on the feeder. Alright, so just be very, very careful about how you're loading your feeder, because it is something that's easy to overlook, you know. Just by lightly squeezing your ground bait in could encourage a nice cloud to come off it if you want to get some activity back in the swim. And on the flip side of that, you might want to press it in really tight so that when it goes in, it goes straight to the bottom. Because sometimes when fish get used to it, if the feeder is only emptying on the bottom, then that's the only place where the fish can get to the bait. So you're almost kind of forcing them to go down, you know, because there aren't any freebies coming off. Because if they want to be at half depth, that's where they want to be naturally. And if they can pick off loose bits of food coming off on the way down, then there's no reason for them to go down to where your hook bait is there? Alright, so it's just thinking about that. And the final one, number 3. Now this is something that may come across a little bit controversial with some people, possibly, but I know for a fact that I've proved it to myself time and time again that we know that fish don't naturally live on the bottom. You know, one of the things that I was taught when I was a kid was that in winter, go for the deep water. If you're going to pick somewhere to fish, go to a lake that's deeper, or the deeper end of the lake, that is where the fish are. And that was always the case, you know, that was always true. However, a lot of the time we didn't catch, even when we knew there were fish there. And that's because one of the key things that we were overlooking was that yes, the fish may be in the deep water, but it doesn't mean to say that they are on the bottom where we can catch them. You know, and since then we've obviously proved it with the sonars that are out there and underwater filming. You know, I've been out there on occasions when I've had loads of fish in front of me in a swim that's 10 or 12 meters deep even, but all the fish are at half depth, you know, which may not sound too bad, but half depth in 12 meters of water means that the fish are 6 meters above your feeder, you know, and it can be very, very difficult to try and catch them. Now, one of the things that I proved to myself, I did it, you know, for myself a couple of years ago, and I've since gone on to prove it with some underwater filming that I've done. And that is basically, if we think the fish are at half depth, then why on earth would we select a ground bait that was this sort of colour? When we go to lots of reservoirs and lakes, you know, a lot of them are clear, you know, clear water. A lot of the venues are like that. And so that's why we tend to go down the dark ground bait mix route, and I totally get that, and that helps my confidence as well. On lots of the shallower venues, on lots of winter venues in particular, when the water clarity is very clear, I will usually always go for a dark mix because I just, you know, I'm just so much more confident in it, and that's how we've caught fish in the past. However, if you're going to a venue that's deep water, we know that light levels, depending on obviously how deep the venue is, light levels are really much lower down there. You know, we know this through underwater filming, and so for me, why on earth would we select a dark mix to blend in with the bottom, for example, of a swim when you're trying to catch the fish down there? It doesn't make any sense to me that, you know, if you've got a dark mix and you're trying to force fish down to the bottom, why would you want to camouflage your bait? It just doesn't make sense when you look at it from that perspective, does it? And it's something that I've proved so many times on some of the natural reservoirs near where I live, where I have literally fished for an hour, 2 hours with dark mixers, dead red maggots, probably the most common of natural baits now, particularly on commercial venues. Dead red maggots don't stand out on the bottom in deep water. You know, we know this for a fact. And I've experimented on multiple occasions where I've suddenly switched to brighter coloured baits, even lighter coloured ground baits, to advertise to the fish that are up there, to advertise to them that there is some bait down here, come and have a look. And on just about every single occasion, it's caught me fish. And I don't mean it's caught me 2 or 3 extra fish. I mean, on some occasions it's gone from not getting a single bite to getting a bite every single cast. You know, so when you think about it that way, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So when I have done it, I've done it with brighter coloured baits. I have gone down a lighter ground bait, a lighter coloured ground bait route. That's one way that you can do it. And the other way you can do it is obviously with your freebies. If you're after bigger fish, one of the best baits for doing that is sweet corn. It's so visual, isn't it? And it obviously can help you pick out a better fish. However, I've found it just as effective with smaller baits as well. Fluorescent maggots, fluoro pinkies, fantastic example. There are other additives that you could use, like these rocks. Obviously you can see the colours there, really bright colours there, to add some sparkle to your ground bait, to show fish that if they are going to look down, to advertise that there's some bait there. There's a simple white maggot, you know, they're really visual baits. And the other one as well is you could introduce chopped corn. I have done that. I don't do that so much now. Chop sweet corn, just put some sweet corn in a pole pot, chop it like you would with worms. You're adding loads of yellow fleck, bits of yellow fleck into your ground bait. And one of the good things about that bait is that you can actually put those pieces of sweet corn, which is just basically sweet corn skin, you can put those on your hook. So if you are getting indications and you think the fish are grazing on your ground bait or possibly eating the corn, that is an option. You can put the corn on, and I have caught lots of fish doing that as well. So it's just about thinking about what you're trying to do. You know, if you're trying to draw fish down in deeper water, why would you camouflage your bait? It just doesn't make sense, does it? And obviously in those deeper water scenarios, overwetting your mix, getting a nice wet cloud as we call it, a tracer following your feeder down, these are all things that we can do to try and encourage the fish to go down to the bottom. These are 3 of the key details that, you know, I employ at least one of these in every single feeder fishing session I fish. Every scenario, and it's amazing how many times that I've been sat on the bank and I've been fishing much more conventionally and I've employed one of these. Sometimes you might employ all 3 at some stage, and it just completely transformed the swim. It's not rocket science, but it's just thinking about what we're actually trying to achieve and trying to use our ground baits and use the selection of feeders that we carry with us to just drill down into an extra level of detail that's going to help you catch a few extra fish. Well, I really hope you've enjoyed this little bit of an insight, and I'm really hoping you're going to get some value from it, and if you have, please give this video a thumbs up. So thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see more videos like this from me on this channel, then please let me know in the comments below. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.